Transforming the Roman world. The objectives are: 1. Characterize the new European civilization, formed by Germanic peoples, the legacy of the Romans, and the Church. And 2, discuss how Charlemagne expanded the Frankish kingdom and created the Carolingian Empire. Now, last we were in the West, we saw the decline of the Roman Empire at the hands of the invading Germanic tribes coming from the north. And largely these were migrations set in motion by the movement of other tribes, particularly the Huns. But the Germanic migration spread through Roman land by the 3rd century, and there are 3 really major tribal groups that end up dominating most of northern Europe, where the Roman Empire had been established. First, the Visigoths, and they occupied Spain once they settled. They also were the ones responsible for sacking Rome itself and pulling down its statues and burning its temples. We also see the Ostrogoths, a tribal group related to the Visigoths, who ultimately occupied Italy. And finally, we see Anglo-Saxons in Britain. That is, 2 groups of people, the Angles and the Saxons, migrating into the region and controlling that territory. And so these groups all together represent a massive shift in what was to be the political structure and cultural climate of the North and the Northern European territories. So we see a decline in Roman power with the emergence of these migrations. So here you can see on the map provided here the various movements of the different tribal groups. First, you see the Huns, here represented with the green arrow, pushing the other tribal groups that were there into Europe proper. Now, we end up seeing, again, the Visigoths moving throughout the territory, but another group not mentioned is the Vandals, who pushed through Spain and inevitably into northern Africa. Now, these groups altogether really destroy much of the European political structure that existed there before. Now, the Germanic rulers really retained the Roman structure of government, and they end up blending their cultural tradition with the Roman cultural tradition. So we see a blending and fusing during this period of history. And it is true that it is not a complete collapse of political structure, but over the long run, we're going to see a transformation such that you can't really consider it the Roman Empire anymore. Now, really by 500, the Western Roman Empire had really been replaced by a number of states ruled by German kings who really didn't consider themselves Romans, and though influenced by Roman culture and Christian ideals, in no sense could they be really considered Roman. Now, inevitably, these new kingdoms that arose in this northern European territory will develop their own cultural identities and have their own legacies. And the first, and perhaps one of the most important in a survey of European history in the medieval period, is the rise of the Frankish kingdom. Now, they are really the only Germanic kingdom which would remain standing over the long run. The Vandal and the Ostrogoths, all of these groups will inevitably collapse in on themselves, but the Franks will survive. And one of the main leaders that will aid in the shift in adaptation through time is Clovis. He's a strong military leader. He established the kingdom, and perhaps what he's most famously known for is somewhere around 500, Clovis converted to Christianity, which means that he's the first Germanic ruler to really do so, at least the Catholic brand of Christianity. And so we see all of a sudden alliance in some sense between Rome and the Franks. Now, this is probably not an accident. I'm sure Clovis was not a fool and could see the political aid and political benefit and political power that might come with such an alliance developed through conversion, which is a trend that will occur throughout history. Now, inevitably, they turn to other Germanic tribes, and through war and through battle, we see conversion. That is, that once the Franks conquer a particular territory, they usually adopt the religion of their king, of their ruler. And since Clovis here is a Catholic Christian, many of his people will follow his lead. Now, the Catholic Church was, again, eager to obtain friendships with these Germanic states to the north, and this will, of course, bolster their relationship with the Frankish kingdoms. Now, Rome itself, while being driven by a desire for having people genuinely convert to their brand of Christianity, itself is driven by an important desire, a desire for preservation. See, the Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore, and so the Roman Empire can't protect the Catholic Church, nor can it protect the city of Rome or the bishoprics or the wealth that might exist in these different territories. And so by making strong alliances with various tribal groups throughout Europe, this would lend itself to serious protection. So inevitably the Frankish kingdom extended from the Pyrenees into the southwest, into the east, expanding and ever growing southward and eastward. Now, Germanic society itself is, in some sense, an intermarriage between what existed before in the Roman Empire and what existed in the old Celtic traditions in the north. So the Germans and Romans intermarried, and they began to create a new society. And so we end up seeing a lot of similar traits that will end up being very important for the long haul, especially for the rise of the medieval period in Europe. We see blood feuds and the breaking of laws in general. But a new system of government is established and new ideas about justice. And one of the most lasting legacies of this idea is the establishment of a fine as punishment for death. See, the problem with blood feuds is that if one continues to go back and forth, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, inevitably we end up seeing a decline in power and a decline in able-bodied fighting men. And fighting in this sense, in this cultural society, amongst oneself weakens you because, they're not going to be able to fight their true enemies. So this is really the source of the idea of a fine, inevitably called weirgild, which means money for a man. That is, that gold would be paid for the life, the weir, of the man. And so this is an important shift in law and justice that will have a legacy up to our own day. But how one finds someone guilty seems strange to us in our modern context. One would have to go through the ordeal, which was the means by which one was determined whether they were guilty in Germanic law. And there were several methods by which this could be done. Fire and water were, of course, tools of judgment. And this would look like throwing someone in a river tide. And if they floated, then they were guilty. And then they would be killed. And if they were innocent, they would sink to the bottom. The idea was that the water, the pure water, would reject the evil and so push it out. But pure water would receive innocence. So you have these complex ideas on how one might be seen as guilty. Another method by which this could be determined is burning someone and wrapping it up and seeing if it would get infected or not. If it festered, then it would mean that you were guilty of the crime. And if it healed properly without infection, without festering, without pus and things like that, then it would mean that you're innocent. So the concept behind this is that the divine forces would not allow an innocent person to be harmed, that they would not be harmed in any way by the divine powers that control everything, which is an important ideal within Christianity itself. Now, the role of the Catholic Church ends up playing a tremendous part in the development of medieval cultural ideas and political structures. Really, as the official Roman state fell apart, the Church played an increasingly important role in the growth of the new European civilization. In many senses, it was the one stable factor that everyone could rely upon. Without the Roman political structure, things were chaotic. Kingdoms and powers would rise and fall, but we end up seeing a stability emerge within the Catholic faith that people could rely upon. Now, how the church was organized was really based around the same model that the Roman Empire had been based around. You end up having parishes, which were local Christian communities. You had a group of parishes headed by a bishop, and this was known as a bishopric, or sometimes referred to as a diocese. And this, of course, is a Roman province controlled by an archbishop. So you can see the layers or hierarchical layers that emerged. So you would have parishes forming bishoprics, and bishoprics forming provinces that would be overseen by archbishops. And this was the means by which the Catholic Church was able to organize itself properly. Now, the head of the Catholic Church and the churches in general were the popes. There were 5 popes originally, and each one was a bishop, essentially, over a major urban center. So there was a bishop or a pope, we might call them. That's what they were called by everyone else, Papa, which means father. And they were called Papa, and Jerusalem had a pope, and Rome, of course, and Constantinople eventually, Antioch. So these different places, major urban centers, had popes. But inevitably, through historical shifts, we end up seeing that many of these areas collapse through invasion. And in the West, you end up seeing one major papal bishopric remain, which is in Rome. And so the head of the Roman Catholic Church was the Pope, which just means father. Now, during this period, one of the most famous popes was Gregory I, or sometimes called Gregory the Great, whom reigned from 590 to 604. And really, he strengthened the power of the papacy, establishing it in a new political order. And he was especially active in converting non-Christian peoples of Germanic Europe to Christianity. He had a very zealous drive to see the European peoples fall in line or convert to Christianity and to Catholic Christianity specifically. And so this is going to be a major shift that begins to occur underneath his supervision. Other things that began to emerge, Christianity began to develop a monastic, ascetic quality to it as well. And these were monks. A monk was a man who separates himself from ordinary human society in order to pursue a life of total dedication to God. And this trend was referred to as monasticism. That is the practice of living the life of a monk, separate from the community. And this was to become holy, because they had this idea that the fleshly pursuits, marriage, and food and drink were all somewhat less holy than the spiritual pursuits. And so these people would leave the communities and not indulge in their sexual or pleasurable experiences, and would devote themselves to something quote-unquote more spiritual. But this was a major shift in the ideology of the Western world, particularly deviating from the Roman concept. And so these people were busy praying for the average person and being tempted by devils, so that devils would tempt the average person. Now, inevitably, many of these monks became so extreme, starving themselves to death, in fact, that a particular monk, Saint Benedict, emerged, in which he created a set of rules by which communities of monks would have to follow and supervise one another. And this became known as the Benedictine rule, and those who followed it, the Benedictine order. And so they're following and listening to the ideas of these monks. He placed an emphasis on prayer and manual labor. He placed regulations on sleep, work, eating, and praying. That is not sleeping less, working more, eating less, and praying more. That wasn't the idea. In fact, what he was insisting upon is that people slept more, that they worked less, that they ate more, and that they prayed less. Why? Because many of these people who went off into these ascetic practices would starve themselves to death, would not sleep whatsoever, would pray ceaselessly, to the point where they would often die within a couple years. And so Benedict saw this as no advantage to the religious tradition and community in the Catholic Church, and so setting out regulations to make a more healthy practice of monasticism. Now, the person who headed up all of these monks was known as an abbot, coming from the Hebrew abba, which means father. And the abbot ran each of these monasteries. And the monastic community came to be seen as the ideal Christian society that could provide a moral example to the wider society, which is, of course, interesting because the ideal figure, at least in the Catholic mindset, was the monk, sexless, devoted to prayer, devoted to scripture reading, fasting regularly. That became the ideal. Now, of course, very few people could meet this ideal or standard, but this became the model of holiness. Now, inevitably, we see this trend also emerge in other territories, not just France or Italy. You see the English and Irish monks, for example, and they were especially enthusiastic about missions and missionaries. They went to various different islands and territories, even sending missionaries from England to the main continent, attempting to spread the gospel to the pagan lands. We also see a trend among women whom also established monastic communities, much like the abbots. And this woman was known as an abbess, and she ran a female monastery in which similar activities would go on: thinking, praying, meditating, labor, prayer. All of these things were similar in both communities, though devoted to their own sex in community. Now, around this same time, we end up seeing the rise of a true European empire, an empire that would, in some sense, have a lasting legacy all the way up into the modern era. It was really during the 600s and 700s that we see kings of the Frankish power, the Frankish kingdom. They gradually lost their power to people known as the mayors of the palace. And these people ended up dominating and forming around their own bloodline a community of leaders that would lead the Franks into a brighter future. Now, one of the most famous of them is Pepin, often referred to as Pepin the Short. And he was the son of Charles Martel, often referred to as Charles the Hammer. And they took control of the Frankish state. Now, Charles Martel was most famous for his battle at the Battle of Tours, stopping the Muslims from coming into France. Pepin the Short, however, his son, ended up solidifying an alliance with Rome that will be most greatly expressed through his son, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. And so their reestablishment and expansion of the territory of the Frankish kingdoms really drove the Franks and the Frankish kingdom into a golden age for northern early medieval society. So the Carolingian Empire is a true empire. It converted and conquered surrounding territories. So the Charlemagne's empire converted much of Western Europe and parts of Central Europe. Now, as he expanded, he devised a means by which to control these people, and that method was called the Missi Dominici, that is, messengers of the Lord, meaning Lord King, not God. And they were sent out in pairs, 2 men, and they were sent out to local districts to ensure that the Lord's will was being carried out, and that the king's wishes were being done. And the reason for 2 is because you didn't want to have one that was holding political power. You wanted both to balance each other out. You don't want competition for your own authority. Because really these Missi Dominici spoke for the king, had the authority of the king, and then when they agreed with each other, that they would have total authority as the king does. So again, this helped the administration of the Frankish Empire, but using 2 people at the same time rather than 1 really allowed for Charlemagne to keep a tighter control over the territory and to make sure that his will was being done. Now, Charlemagne, after having struck that agreement with Rome, inevitably created a kingdom of Europe. That is, he was conquering all these territories, and many called this the New Roman Empire. And really, in 800, Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor. And he saw himself as a Roman emperor, just like Julius Caesar or Augustus before. And now, culturally, there's no way we can really even consider this a Roman empire and this a Roman king. The idea that it is Roman really comes from the idea that the Catholic Church considered itself the vehicle of the Roman Empire that had once existed, and vesting him with that same title. Now, inevitably, this will end up being referred to as the Holy Roman Empire versus just the Roman Empire. But we see an idea of the legacy of the Roman Empire and the power of the idea of the Roman Empire. The idea of an enduring Roman Empire was important, and in fact, many kings looked to these Roman emperors and Roman rulers to imagine how one should govern their people. And Charlemagne will also inevitably be the model for future medieval kings on how to be Roman and how to run one's empire, which is a massive shift going on in this culture. But Charlemagne's also well known for the fact that he fostered and supported the development of the intellectual arts and the intellectual practices. We see an intellectual revival and renewal, often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne funded educators and education of the clergy. He wanted all of his officials to be literate, particularly for the functioning of the government. He wanted an educated people. And so the Carolingian Renaissance is really a renewal revival of Latin and classical works. In fact, it's during this period that we see an explosion of art, of manuscript writing, of manuscript illumination, and particularly the invention of minuscule, that is, writing with lowercase letters, and having spaces between your words. Because Roman Latin, the Roman Latin of old, was all capitals and no spaces between the words. And so it's really thanks to Charlemagne and Charlemagne's coin that allowed for the development of minuscule and the popularization therein, supported by his funds. And so many people call the medieval age, which we're clearly talking about here, and which has really blossomed here, as a dark age, a dank, dark, uneducated age. And while it certainly is a decrease in the artistic and intellectual skills of the Roman Empire, it is by itself certainly not devoid of art and devoid of learning. The art has changed. Particularly when you look at the popularization of manuscript illumination, drawing images in the books that are being written, and very geometric, and would even paint in gold and things like that on parchment. So a major shift that's occurring even in the arts and what would be considered good art. Now, by the 800s, the Benedictine monks began copying manuscripts in what were known as scriptoria, which were writing rooms. These monks would sit at desks and copy books, and it took years to copy one book. In fact, to copy the Bible, you would copy it word for word, letter by letter, and it would take somewhere around 3 years to write a copy. So if you could imagine then, books are expensive, very expensive. And yes, there's a revival, and yes, there's an easier way to read due to minuscule. And the Carolingians are really popularizing it again, but it's only accessible to the incredibly wealthy. Not only because they're the ones who can read, but they're the only ones who could ever afford a book, because imagine, if you will, an item that would take 3 years to make and how much that might cost. Very expensive. So most people would not have any access to writing material, let alone a Bible. Now, most of the ancient Roman works we have today exist because they were copied by Carolingian monks. Much of what was lost were items that the Carolingians had no copies of to make copies, or they were texts that they deemed not worthy to transmit to the next generation. And so we really must be grateful to some extent in remembering the task and duty that that these Carolingian monks had, this dedication toward copying and transmitting these written works, works by Plato and Josephus, and major works through time. The objectives were, 1, characterize the new European civilization formed by the Germanic peoples, the legacy of the Romans and the Church. And 2nd, discuss how Charlemagne expanded the Frankish kingdom and created the Carolingian Empire.